Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 7. Angela showed no sign of the night's despair when she came down to breakfast, dressed for riding, for she had received a message with her early tea that she was to accompany the two men round the estate. Clive offered a vague apology for his desertion, explaining that they had decided to go fishing, as it was such a lovely night. They had met a smack owner at the pub, and driven down with him to the coast, whence they had put out to sea. In fact, we're only just back, he concluded. Ralph looked a little wilted after a sleepless night, but Clive showed no sign of fatigue. The explanation was perfectly genuine, as the fresh mackerel cooked for breakfast proved. Angela scolded herself for being possessive, though she did say that Clive might have let her know he intended to be out all night. I didn't want to disturb anybody by ringing up, and I thought you'd be sound asleep, he excused himself. We weren't worried, were you? Ralph, who was more perceptive, inquired. I'm afraid we're very apt to do things on impulse, and Clive forgot you aren't used to our ways. When something exciting turns up, we leap at it, and Ma long since ceased to worry about us. You can't keep a Stratton on a leading rein. Precisely what she was thinking. The morning was so fresh and sunny that her heaviness of the night before disappeared. Celia did not come down to breakfast. Clive was attentive and Ralph amusing, so that she decided Abbotswood was a very good place to be in. Down at the stables, Clive asked his brother to choose her a mount from among the half-dozen riding horses. Something fairly docile, he said. I've been away so long I don't know these beasts, and I don't want her to break her pretty neck. He gave Angela a glance which caused her heart to flutter. He was looking very attractive in yellow sweater, breeches and polished boots. When Ralph brought out a saddled horse, he lifted her onto its back with firm possessive hands. Her spirits rose as she looked down at him from that elevation and saw a flicker of flame in his eyes. He had not become indifferent. It was only the pressure of the events of the last few days that had kept him from her. Perhaps he really had believed she had been over-fatigued back in Kabul, and had bridled his desires to let her rest. Tonight she would insist that she needed no further solicitude, and triumph over the memory of that dark siren enshrined in her stepmother's anteroom. A gallop over the fields drove away any lingering apprehensions. It was good to be alive, to feel a swift horse under her, to have Clive in pursuit of her, for being of much lighter weight, her mount outdistanced his. They returned in high spirits, and Ralph complimented her upon her horsemanship. The mule must have been excellent practice, he observed slyly, and if your tennis is equal to your riding, I'll have a job to beat you. I haven't played tennis since I was at school, so I don't suppose I'll be in your class. Do you want to beat me? Of course, to establish my male superiority, but if Clive partners you, you'll wipe the court with me. He glanced admiringly at his half-brother. He's tops at everything, and he's played at Wimbledon. That was in my salad days, Clive interposed. I'm out of practice too, but I think I must go over the farm accounts this afternoon. If that's when you're thinking of playing. I should have thought you could take a few days' holiday before you take over, Ralph pointed out. Sorry. Isn't this still your honeymoon? Angela coloured, and he laughed delightedly. Good Lord, Clive, this wife of yours can still blush. What an enchanting phenomenon among our hard-boiled lassies. If I went out to Persia, would I find another like her? Most improbable. Angela's unique, Clive told him, drawing his wife's arm through his. Words and action pleased her so much that she felt capable of coping with the venom of a dozen stepmothers at lunch. Mrs. Stratton, however, seemed subdued. She contributed little to the lively banter between the younger ones. Ralph was expecting visitors that afternoon to play tennis, including a girl called Cathy. Who was my latest flame until you appeared, he told Angela. Poor Cathy, Angela laughed, but she'll know I can't be a serious rival. Why not? Celia Stratton's voice was harsh. This is a permissive age, and she wouldn't be the first Stratton bride to play the wanton. Angela stared at her, aware of sudden tension. She glanced at Clive and saw his face was bleak. Ralph broke the constant constraint by saying, Wanton, what a delightfully old-fashioned word. Shakespearean, isn't it? Nowadays we use a biblical one, but it doesn't apply to Angela. I'm quite sure she isn't permissive. Unfortunately. He looked so rueful that Angela had to laugh, while Clive had the self-satisfied look of a man who owns what other men desire. The awkward moment passed, but she was left with a query. Who was the unfaithful Stratton bride? Some cavalier ancestress in a notoriously promiscuous age? Or someone nearer to hand to provoke Clive's grim look. Could it possibly have been Jasmine? During the afternoon, she forgot the incident in the turmoil of tennis. Cathy duly arrived with a brother in tow, a healthy, hearty young sportswoman, who claimed Ralph as her partner in spite of his obvious reluctance. She proceeded to make mincemeat of her opponents, although Ralph was only playing half-heartedly. Angela and her brother only won one game in the first set, and it looked as if the second one was going to be love to the other side until Clive came onto the court. Score 5 games to 0, Ralph called. Take Brian's racket, Clive. Score 5 games to 0, Ralph called. Take Brian's racket, Clive, and give Angela a boost. Oh, shit. Let's finish this set. Let's finish this set, Cathy objected, anxious to win. That's not a good accent. But Brian handed his racket to Clive to make what should have been his service. The 4 smashing balls Clive put down into the court won him a love game. Then Ralph seemed to rouse himself, and the next was bitterly fought. Stimulated by the fast play, Angela found herself returning balls she would normally have missed or sent into the net. Cathy fought well and gamely to support Ralph's brilliant play, but they were not a match for Clive, even though Angela was not a great support to him. After she had taken the service, which mercifully she usually managed to return, he told her, "Leave it to me." They retrieved the set and won it, to Cathy's chagrin. I had no idea you were such a powerful player. I had no idea you were such a powerful player, she said to Clive. He grinned. I haven't played for years. Didn't know I still could. Old champions never die, Ralph sang tunelessly. Clive and Jassy won the mixed doubles at Wimbledon one year, Cathy. She was... oh, God. Oh, come on. She was even better than he was. Jassy? Cathy queried, then recollecting something she had been told. Oh, yes, of course, and began to talk of something else. For Angela, the sunlight suddenly seemed suddenly clouded. She had enjoyed the game and admired Clive's proficiency, standing by the net, still breathing a little fast from his exertions, his fair hair ruffled by the slight breeze. He looked almost a boy, the boy he had been when he partnered Jassy. Angela had been proud of him and her small part in supporting him. Then had come Ralph's careless words, uttered she was sure without thought. Jasmine had been a champion player. She had partnered Clive in Wimbledon in distant days, when Angela had been only a child. Had he recalled Jasmine when she had made blunders? Her brilliance? Her grace? He must have given up tennis when she had died, finding it too poignant a reminder of his loss. Perhaps this was the first time he had played since, and the game must have recalled her. Gosh, what a clangor, Ralph muttered beside her. Why can't I keep my tongue off that wench? I'm getting as bad as Ma. Cathy and Brian were talking eagerly to Clive. The girl, too, had Wimbledon aspirations, and the disclosure that he had played there had excited her. That Clive was reluctant to speak about it did not deter her. Ralph watched them gloomily swinging his racket. You can't help it, Angela told him. Jasmine's still here, you know. She haunts the place. That's a bit far-fetched, honey, she shivered. I'm conscious of it, you're not. I suppose you were very fond of her, too. My dear girl, she was years older than me, and she had no use for schoolboys. Actually, I was away at college when she died. I don't know any details. Ma was devastated, and Clive went away. I missed him a lot more than I did her. That marriage was a ghastly mistake, but Ma had it organised from the time they were infants. She wanted Jassy to be mistress here. He wrinkled his dark brows. I don't think Jass was all that keen. She had other fish to fry. But wasn't she in love with him? I don't think Jassy was capable of loving anyone except herself, but neither of them would dream of confiding in me. Look out, the Wimbledon conclave is breaking up. Clive was coming towards them. I shouldn't be deluging you with family history, Ralph laid a hand upon her arm and added earnestly, but it is history. It was all over nearly 10 years ago. Angela wished she could believe it was. Since they were a quartet, they played bridge after dinner. When Angela admitted she could not play, Celia insisted she must learn. Bridge was a social necessity, but Angela had no aptitude for cards. She bid wildly and could not remember which trumps were out. Clive, who was her partner, announced wryly that if they had been playing for money, she would have ruined him. Clive smiled with satisfaction, from which Angela deduced that Jasmine had been a skilful player, and this was an attempt to humiliate her. However, it misfired because the men ceased to take her efforts seriously and derived considerable amusement from her naive blunders. On their way to bed, Celia waylaid Clive. Some problem had arisen about which she must consult him. She favoured Angela with her hostile stare while she demanded her husband's presence. Angela went upstairs alone. Ralph had preceded them. She undressed and showered and put on the negligee which she had bought at Clive's instigation for her wedding night. The nightdress was in pale gold double nylon, the overgown in apricot with golden frills. It fell about her in a froth of diaphanous drapery. Her long hair she brushed and left loose. She picked up the scent spray on her dressing table and deluged herself in Evening in Paris, and hoped it was a perfume Clive liked. She heard Clive's voice in the passage, bidding his stepmother good night. She held her breath in anticipation, listening for the sound of soft footfalls along the carpeted passage, willing him to knock upon the door. The footsteps went past, and she heard a door open and close, the one into his dressing-room. There were vague sounds from within, and then he went into the bathroom. He was there some time, probably also taking a shower. Then he re-entered his dressing-room. She wondered vaguely if the bed in it had been made up. She had a suspicion that it was, probably on Celia's orders. She waited, but there was no further sound from behind the door connecting their rooms. He was not coming to her, not even to say good night. She switched off her light and drew back the curtains from her window. It was a still, starlight night, awaiting the rising of the waning moon, with falling dew. The garden scents invaded her nostrils: lilac, syringa, and jasmine. From a tree to the side of the house came the amorous moan of wood doves. A pair nested there, and their intermittent cooing could be heard all night. Angela's eyes went to the line of light under Clive's door. He was still awake, perhaps reading as he often did to compose his mind for sleep. A chapter of a dull book is an excellent soporific, he had once told her. She drew a deep breath, summoned up all her resolution, and went to open the door. She turned the handle softly, dreading she might find it locked, and all that would imply. It was not. Quietly she opened it and stepped inside. Clive was seated on the bed, a maroon silk robe covering his lean length. He was perusing a batch of papers which looked commercial, and was making occasional notes on a pad lying on the bedside table. The soft glow from the lamp also set upon it turned his hair to molten gold and his smooth brown face to copper. There were as yet few lines upon it. Angela stood silent, regarding him, until, becoming aware of her presence, he looked up and saw her. "Hello, Wave," he said pleasantly. "Anything wrong?" "Everything's wrong," she told him passionately. "To start with, you haven't said good night." "How very remiss of me." A wary look had come into his eyes at her tone, but he spoke lightly. Carefully putting his papers under the lamp, he stood up. "Mother distracted me." He brushed his hair back from his forehead, a familiar gesture. "Good night, my dear." He put his hands on her shoulders and gently touched her cheek with his lips. "Sleep well." This dismissal, as if she were a tiresome child, was too much for her. Fiercely she cried, "Oh, Clive, why are you so cold?" And flinging her arms about his neck, she clung to him. "I'm your wife!" "I'm your wife," she whispered into his neck. "Not your sister." She felt a tremor run through his body. His arms closed round her automatically. His mouth sought hers. Triumph swelled in her breast. It had only needed a little audacity to win him back. His lips moved from hers to linger on her throat, her neck, and down towards her breast. "Come to bed," she whispered, and got no further, for he suddenly, almost violently, thrust her away from him. She saw the pupils of his eyes had expanded, turning the grey to black, and his nostrils quivered. "Did you have to bathe yourself in scent?" he asked harshly. "I loathe the stuff." "So much for evening in Paris." Astonished, bewildered, she stammered, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." He stood regarding her flowing drapery, her cloud of hair, and a spasm crossed his face. "Are you trying to play Delilah?" he demanded. Those sort of tricks don't appeal to me. I like my women honest." "Yes, no. Clive, you're being horrible," she cried childishly. He passed his hand wearily over his eyes. "I'm sorry, Angela. That scent has associations," she said with a flash of temper. "I suppose Jasmine used it." He made no rejoinder, but turned away, absently rearranging the articles on the dressing table. "Is it always like this with a second wife?" she went on bitterly. "Is it always like this with a second wife?" she went on bitterly. "Perpetual reminders, comparisons. I know I can't compete with her, but you're still obsessed by her. You should never have married again." He looked at her somberly. "I married you to give you a name," he reminded her, "and to get you out of Afghanistan." "And you expect me to be everlastingly grateful? If that was all... But if that was all, why did you insist upon making it a real marriage?" "Because I wanted you," he said simply. "Which you no longer do." She paused, hoping he would deny her statement, but he said nothing. "You should have had more foresight, Clive," she continued accusingly. I appreciate your chivalrous act, of course, but if you'd kept it a marriage in name only, we could have got it dissolved when we were back in England. Now we'll have to wait ages before we can get a divorce." No. Do you want a divorce? She did not. She wanted to cling to what little she had of him, even if she had to share him with Jasmine. Words he had spoken returned to her. Most women have to share their husbands, but in this case, Jasmine had taken the larger portion. "Don't you?" she countered. "No, I do not," he told her unexpectedly. "I know you're feeling sore, but the fact is... No, I can't explain yet. But everything will come all right if you'll be patient, my dear. Give me a little time." "Time for what?" she interrupted. "To forget Jasmine? You can't. The whole place simply reeks of her, and Mrs. Stratton does all she can to keep her memory alive." "That's why I'm considering living somewhere else." He indicated the papers he had been perusing. "Those are house agent's particulars, away from Mother. We could make a fresh start." "But this is your home." "It hasn't been a home for a long while. I used to love it." He moved restlessly, but she poisoned it for me. She did not know if he meant Jasmine or his stepmother. Sitting down on the bed, she said sadly, "What a pity. It's such a charming house." "So you like it? I thought you were a town girl." "We only lived in a town because it was more convenient for Daddy with so much coming and going, but he always hoped to retire into the country. He'd have loved Abbotswood." "Ah, yes, your father." A peculiar expression came into his eyes that she could not interpret. "Almost I could wish that you'd remained a nameless waif." "You were anxious enough for me to regain my memory, and you ought to be pleased that I'm a famous archaeologist's daughter, when I might have been someone much less desirable for all we knew. Daddy was top-notch in his field, you know." "And you're very proud of him?" "Of course I am." She looked at him uncertainly, sensing some sort of antagonism. "Oh, I wish you could have known him. I'm sure you would have got on well together. You'd have had a lot in common, for he was a wanderer too." Clive turned away with a harsh laugh. "Yes, we had something in common." Puzzled by his attitude, she asked, "Have you got something against archaeologists?" "I don't like the breed." He gave somewhat vague reasons. They had been known to smuggle out treasures that belonged to countries where they were working. They neglected their families to pursue their mania. Stung by such unjustifiable prejudice, she told him, "That last could apply to you. Aren't you planning to go to Bolivia?" "No. When it was suggested, it seemed a solution to a problem, but I'm not sure it is now, and as Ralph's going to London, I'm needed here." Angela experienced a flood of relief. She had dreaded his departure, and though it was not flattering that she was not one of his reasons for staying, at least she would not be parted from him. As for the problem he mentioned, that must be Jasmine, though he would never solve that by continuing to run away. Since he was going to stay, it was all the more important that she should break down the incomprehensible barrier that seemed to have risen between them. A possible explanation occurred to her. "Has the discovery of my parentage put you against me?" she demanded. "Surely you can't be so unfair and unreasonable." He did not answer, and she went on vehemently. "Daddy was a fine man, an honest man. He'd never stoop to steal, and he didn't have much inducement to stay at home. Mother was forever ailing and nagging at him, but he always came back to her when a more selfish man would have left her." It's sometimes convenient to have a wife in the background," Clive observed sarcastically. Angela shook back her hair and stared at him defiantly. "Look, has someone been telling lies about Daddy? If so, I'd like to know so I can refute them." "Your loyalty does you credit," he said gently. "Keep your illusions, child. Far be it from me to destroy them." "Then you have had something," he shrugged his shoulders. Why should I? Dissatisfied, for she was sure he was being evasive, she told him, "You shouldn't credit gossip, though I'm sure there could be none about Daddy." "I never heard any." "Well, then." She searched his unrevealing face and sighed. "You're an enigma, Clive. Something has changed you, and I don't know what it can be, unless—" Her lips quivered. "You find me too young and childish, and you're bored with me. I haven't any feminine wiles to entertain you." So great a contrast to Jasmine with her sexy lure. "Thank God for that," Clive exclaimed. "Though I don't know what else this is." He lightly touched her negligee and smiled "Though I don't know what else this is." He lightly touched her negligee and smiled mockingly. "It was bought to please you," she reminded him. "So it was, but an honest woman doesn't need frills and scent to keep her husband's respect," he told her. But it was not respect that she wanted, and she was sure he had substituted it for another word. She looked at him appealingly, but he would not meet her eyes. "You'd better go to bed, little one," he bade her. Despondently, she moved towards the door. The big master bedroom yawned emptily before her. "I'm going to yawn." The room Clive must have shared with his first wife. Celia knew what she was doing when she insisted that they must occupy it. She turned round and saw that Clive was reaching for his papers again. "I suppose the truth is you dislike my room because it was Jasmine's," she said bitterly, "and you can't bear to be with me in the bed." "It was never her bed," he corrected her. "She always had the room Mother's in now, nor did I ever sleep with her." But she was your wife." Astonished, she moved towards him. "You may as well know the truth. She ran out on me on our wedding day." He laughed at Angela's incredulous expression. "You're jumping to conclusions, my wife. Technically, she was my wife, in that we went through the marriage ceremony, the empty vows which she never meant to keep and broke within the next 24 hours. He moved to the window and stared to fiddle with the curtains. Angela sat down on the bed again, her eyes fixed expectantly upon his back. "But why wait until the last minute?" she asked. "It seems a lot of trouble for nothing." It was a lot of trouble for nothing, but Jassy had always fancied a white wedding, and what Jassy fancied she got, with no thought to the trouble and pain she caused. Well, she had her fun, the whole county in attendance, me dressed up like a tailor's dummy, herself in white lace and satin, a train a mile long, a cake 6 feet high. He leaned his head against the window frame and closed his eyes. Angela wanted to go to him, to draw his head down upon her breast, to comfort him for that past hurt, but it was not comfort from her he wanted, and besides, she wished to hear the rest of the story. He continued in sharp, clipped sentences. "We were going up to Scotland by motor rail for the honeymoon after spending a night in London. At the reception she said she felt ill. She went up to her room and threw a fit of hysterics. Mother gave her a sedative, told us she wasn't fit to travel. That was a damper on the proceedings. I felt an utter fool. We got rid of the guests somehow. Mother told me I mustn't disturb my bride. She had had a brainstorm, but she was sure she'd be all right next day after a good sleep. We could cut the night in London and go straight up to Scotland. But in the morning, Jasmine had gone." "Oh, no!" Angela exclaimed. She had followed his narrative intently, her imagination filling in the details. She could visualize the glamorous Jasmine sweeping up the aisle. She must have looked superb, to where a younger Clive awaited her immaculate in morning dress. Waited her immaculate in morning dress, his eager eyes alight as they feasted on his bride's beauty. It was the sort of scene that was the climax of a young girl's romantic dreams, for even sophisticated modern youth still yearns for a white satin and a church spectacle, with her man waiting for her by a flower-decked altar. Clive would have represented every girl's ideal, young, ardent, and handsome. What a pair he and Jasmine must have made, but Jasmine had fled from him. "Why?" "Why?" she asked blankly. Turning from the window, Clive said sardonically, "Because what none of us realized was that Jasmine was only attracted by the unobtainable. Mother had always planned that she should marry me. She wanted to see Jasmine mistress of Abbotswood when my father went, and that was always understood while Jassy and I were growing up. But she was so sure of me that I lost any appeal I might once have had for her." He smiled wryly and resumed, "She was in London during my father's last illness. Mother considered a house containing an invalid too depressing for a young woman, and he wasn't her father. He was ill a long time before the end. Jassy had a whale of a time and ran heavily into debt. Among other extravagances, she put up a large sum towards an archaeological expedition to the Med." He paused, and Angela thought she saw a chink of daylight. But it was unfair to censure an honourable profession because of the folly of a girl. She said defensively, "But, Clive, that's not unusual. Big expeditions have to have sponsors. Even students pay premiums for the privilege of being included." "Jasmine didn't care a hoot about excavations," he returned. "It was the personnel she was interested in. Well, Mother had to sort her out. I think she paid all her debts out of what my father left her on condition that Jasmine came home and married me. Naturally, I didn't know anything about their bargain. I was delighted that Jasmine had returned to me. She bewitched me, Angela." He sounded almost apologetic. "She was maddeningly alluring." "You needn't tell me that," Angela commented bitterly. "I've gathered that for myself." Clive did not seem to hear her. His eyes had an inward brooding look as he reviewed the past. She left a note when she fled. A typical Jasmine touch. She stated that she'd enjoyed the wedding. It had been a good show, her description. I'll not forget it. But she decided she'd rather go on a dig than up to Scotland. Touring was a bit of a drag. No regret for leaving me in the lurch, no apology for the humiliation she had brought on the family. She might have been declining a casual invitation. We traced her to London Airport, but her flight had gone, and that was the last we heard of her for some months. "You mean she came back?" "Yes, when her lover had ditched her, for of course she'd gone with a man. He was a great deal older than herself and married. She told us offhandedly that he'd promised to divorce his wife if she would free herself. But he had changed his mind and gone back to his home. She declared she was well rid of him. He'd become a bore, but that was mere bravado. Her vanity, the biggest part of her, had taken a hard knock. Mother urged me to forgive her and take her back, and I was so besotted I believed I might have done, but before I could bring myself to pardon her, she was dead." "In an accident?" "So the coroner decided. She'd gone down to the coast and hired a boat, which capsized. She was drowned." "How dreadful!" Clive looked at her with unseeing eyes. At the inquest it was discovered she was pregnant, but it couldn't have been my child. Angela gave a small sound of distress, and Clive laughed. "Not a pretty story, is it?" "Only Mother and I knew that, of course, and poor Mother was demented. She put all the blame on the man for enticing Jasmine away from her duty. She wanted me to go after him and shoot him. 150 years ago I might have called him out, but now we live in a more civilized society, and this sort of irregularity is all too common. Nor did I consider Jasmine was worth committing murder for, so Mother had to content herself with demanding vengeance from heaven, and her imprecations were quite spine-chilling." "I suppose it relieved her feelings," Angela said with a shiver. "Mrs. Stratton must have been awe-inspiring in her rage." "Mrs. Stratton must have been awe-inspiring in her rage. At least it couldn't do anybody any harm." "I don't know about that," Clive returned in an odd voice. "The man was killed." "But that could only have been a coincidence," Angela insisted. "So you knew who he was?" "Of course I did. But his name's best forgotten." Angela thought it was a pity Jasmine's could not be forgotten too, but her hold over Clive must have been very strong to have lasted for so many years. "I'm glad you've told me all this," she said. "I'll feel more sympathetic towards Mrs. Stratton now, though I don't see why she has to take it out on me. I've never harmed her, but I suppose she can't bear to have Jasmine supplanted." She looked doubtfully at her husband. "Perhaps now we've come back here, you feel the same way." "Don't talk rubbish," he said brusquely, "and I think you imagine much of Mother's hostility. So long as you don't—" He broke off and glanced at her warily. Silence fell between them, while outside the moaning of the doves was clearly audible. Clive's gaze wandered over Angela's slight form clad in the filmy drapery put on to entice him, her long hair that he had liked to play with during her so brief period of happiness, her dark, troubled eyes. His own eyes kindled. He made a movement towards her, and Angela's heart leaped, but before he could touch her, he checked himself and turned away. "No," he said firmly. "There's something that has to be put right before—" Again he broke off and looked faintly embarrassed. "Clive, what's the difficulty?" "Can't you tell me?" she urged eagerly. He shook his head. "It might distress you. I'll explain when I've made the necessary arrangements, but I'm sure it'll be all right eventually." "You mean leaving here?" she hazarded. "Not entirely." He looked at her again, but now his glance was cold. "Meanwhile, Angela, for God's sake, don't try to play the seductress. You don't know what harm you're doing. Go to bed. It's very late." This abrupt dismissal chilled her, and she rose obediently to her feet. "Good night, Clive," she said wistfully. "Good night, Angela," he returned without looking at her. Sadly, she trailed into her own room. She was tired of mysteries and evasions, and the deduction she drew from Jasmine's story was that Clive was still entirely obsessed with his first wife. She put no reliance upon his vague assurance that their relationship would eventually be all right. Jasmine's influence was still paramount at Abbotswood, and if he were hoping a change of residence would break her spell, Angela thought he was deceiving himself. Jasmine would follow them wherever they went, and she herself was quite incapable of compensating for her loss.